Welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into a book that I think you'll find fascinating. It's called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert B. Cialdini.
Ah, yes. Influence. It's a classic for a reason. It really unlocks those secrets behind why we say yes, even when we don't necessarily want to or consciously intend to.
It's like we're being pulled by these invisible strings sometimes.
Exactly. And Cialdini did some really interesting research on this. He actually went out and studied compliance professionals like salespeople and marketers and fundraisers to figure out what tactics they use to get people to say yes.
So he went undercover, in a way, to see these principles in action firsthand.
He did. And what he found is that they all rely on these universal principles of influence, these psychological triggers that affect us all.
It's like we're running on autopilot sometimes, reacting to these triggers without even realizing it.
It is. And Cialdini actually compares it to the fixed action patterns you see in nature.
Like those mother turkeys that respond instinctively to the cheep, cheep sound of their chicks. They're programmed to respond to that sound, even if it's coming from a predator mimicking the chicks.
That's a great example. It highlights how efficient these automatic responses can be, but also how they can leave us vulnerable to manipulation.
So in a way, we're all a bit like those mother turkeys, vulnerable to those sneaky predators who know exactly which buttons to push.
It's true, and that's why it's so important to understand these principles, not just to become better persuaders ourselves, but to protect ourselves from being manipulated.
Absolutely. It's about taking back control and making conscious, informed decisions rather than being led along by those hidden strings.
I completely agree. And speaking of making conscious decisions, have you ever noticed how some people just radiate this positive energy?
Yeah.
I recently came across this YouTube channel called Affirmify Journey that's all about cultivating that kind of positive energy.
Interesting. What kind of content do they offer?
It's all about personal growth and self-improvement with a focus on motivation and positive thinking.
I'll have to check them out. Now, let's dive into the first principle that Cialdini outlines in Influence, reciprocity. This one really highlights how deeply ingrained the need to repay favors is in us humans.
It's true. Even if we didn't ask for the favor in the first place, we're wired for fairness, and it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. In early human societies, cooperation and reciprocity were essential for survival.
Right. If you didn't reciprocate favors, you might be ostracized from the group.
Exactly. And this ancient social contract still runs deep within us. But as with all of these principles, it can be exploited.
So while reciprocity can be a force for good, it can also be used against us.
Sadly, yes. Think of the Reagan study that Cialdini describes in the book. People were more likely to buy raffle tickets from someone who had previously given them a free Coke, even if they didn't even like the person.
Wow, that's amazing. It really highlights the power of even an unsolicited gift. It creates that sense of obligation, whether we want it or not.
It does. And Cialdini argues that even unwanted gifts can trigger this feeling of indebtedness, like those BUG products from Amway.
The ones where salespeople would leave a whole bag of products at your house for free, knowing you'd feel obligated to buy something when they came back.
Exactly. It's a sneaky tactic because it plays on our natural inclination to even the score.
It's like they're setting a trap, using our own sense of fairness against us. So how do we guard against this? It feels wrong to reject a gift, even if you suspect there might be strings attached.
The key is awareness. When someone is overly generous, especially if they then ask for something in return, ask yourself, is this genuine kindness? Or is this a calculated move to influence my behavior?
That's a good reminder to be cautious. Now, you mentioned even unwanted gifts can trigger this obligation. Is there any way to break free from that feeling of indebtedness once it's been established?
Well, Cialdini shares this really powerful story about Diane Louis, one of the few survivors of the Jonestown Massacre. She attributes her survival to consciously refusing special favors from Jim Jones.
It's a chilling example, but it shows the importance of recognizing those situations where accepting favors might lead to a dangerous sense of obligation down the line.
Exactly. And on a lighter note, there's another aspect of reciprocity that Cialdini talks about, concessions. This is where the door-in-the-face technique comes into play.
I've definitely experienced that one. It's like when someone asks for something huge that they know you'll refuse, and then they follow up with a smaller, more reasonable request.
Precisely. Let's say I ask you to volunteer at a homeless shelter every weekend for a year. You'd probably say no.
Definitely. But if you then ask me to just donate a few cans of food, I'd be much more likely to say yes.
And that's the brilliance of the technique. By making that initial large request, I've made a concession. Now you feel obligated to reciprocate by agreeing to the smaller request.
It's almost like a subtle negotiation where both parties end up feeling like they've won something.
Exactly. And research shows that it not only increases compliance, but it also leads to greater satisfaction with the agreement. People feel better about saying yes when they feel like they've influenced the outcome.
So it's not just about getting someone to comply, it's about making them feel good about complying.
It is. And this highlights how we can use concessions strategically to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes.
This is making me wonder about all the other subtle ways reciprocity might be at play in our everyday lives.
It's everywhere. Even something as small as holding the door for someone or offering a compliment can trigger that sense of obligation, however small.
So it's like we're constantly exchanging these social currencies.
We are. It's all part of this intricate web of social influence.
This is all so fascinating. It makes you want to pay closer attention to all those subtle cues in our everyday interactions. Now, I'm curious about the next principle, liking. Is it really as simple as we're more likely to say yes to people we like?
On the surface, it might seem that way. But Cialdini delves into some really interesting nuances about how this principle operates. Our brains are wired to favor those we like, but sometimes that liking is based on factors we might not even consciously recognize.
So it's not just about being a nice person. It's about understanding what triggers liking on a deeper level.
Exactly. And one of the most surprising factors is physical attractiveness. Studies have shown that we tend to perceive attractive people as more talented, intelligent, even trustworthy.
It seems a bit unfair that our brains make those snap judgments based purely on appearance.
It is. It's called the halo effect, and it's a powerful example of how our unconscious biases can influence our perceptions and decisions.
But surely liking goes beyond just looks, right? What are some other factors that come into play?
Well, we're also naturally drawn to people who are similar to us, even in small ways.
Like growing up in the same town, going to the same school, or even sharing a love for the same band.
Precisely. Those shared experiences, however small, create a sense of connection and familiarity, which can lead to increased liking.
It's like our brains are saying, hey, this person gets me, they're one of us.
Exactly. And you know, some compliance professionals are actually trained to subtly mimic their target's body language and verbal style to build rapport.
Wait, so they're intentionally creating a false sense of similarity to get us to like them. That's unsettling.
It can be. But by being aware of this tactic, we can recognize when someone might be trying to manufacture a connection that isn't genuine.
So it's about being discerning and questioning that sense of liking, especially in situations where someone is trying to persuade us.
Exactly. It's crucial to separate the person from the request and evaluate the request on its own merits. Now, here's another factor that contributes to liking: compliments. Even if we think they might be insincere, compliments generally make us like the person more, and therefore more likely to comply with their requests.
It's true. There's a reason why the saying, flattery will get you everywhere, exists. But if we know it's a tactic, does it still work?
It can, because it taps into our innate desire to be liked and appreciated. It makes us feel good about ourselves, which can make us more receptive to the person giving the compliment.
So how do we avoid being swayed by this undue liking in a compliance situation?
It's about being self-aware. If you find yourself really liking someone who's trying to persuade you of something, take a step back and ask yourself, is this liking genuine? Or is it being manufactured to influence my decision?
It's like a reminder to be present and aware in the interaction, not just passively reacting to these triggers. Now, this all makes me think about the influence of groups. Is there a principle that addresses how our behavior changes when we're part of a group?
There is. It's Cialdini's principle of social proof. This one highlights how we look to others' actions to determine what's correct, especially when we're feeling uncertain. We're social creatures. It's natural to seek guidance from the group.
It's like those nightclubs that create long lines outside to make the club seem more popular. Even if the music's terrible, a long line suggests it must be the place to be.
Exactly. We see that and think, well, all those people can't be wrong, so it must be good. And it's not just about popularity. This influences our behavior in all sorts of situations.
Like the Werther effect, which Cialdini also talks about. Publicized suicides can actually lead to copycat suicides, which is a scary thought.
It's a stark example of how powerful social proof can be, especially when we're feeling lost or uncertain.
So how do we defend ourselves against this kind of manipulation? It feels natural to want to follow the crowd, especially when we're not sure what to do.
The key, again, is awareness. If you see a crowd forming or hear claims about something being the best or most popular, take a moment to pause and assess the situation for yourself.
Don't just blindly follow the herd.
Right. Ask yourself, is this genuine social proof, or is it being manufactured to steer me in a particular direction?
And this is especially important in today's world, with all the online reviews and testimonials that can easily be manipulated.
Absolutely. Be a critical thinker. Now, another potential danger of social proof is the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance. This is where everyone in a group is looking to each other for clues on how to act, but no one actually knows what's going on.
This usually happens in emergency situations, right? Like when
Mhm.
someone needs help, but everyone assumes someone else has already called for help.
Exactly. And it can lead to a kind of paralysis where no one takes action because they assume someone else is handling it. Cialdini describes a case where a woman fell into a ditch on a busy street and no one stopped to help because everyone assumed someone else must have already called 911.
That's a tragic example of how our reliance on social cues can backfire, leading to inaction when action is desperately needed.
And it highlights the importance of being assertive and trusting your own instincts in ambiguous situations. If something seems wrong, don't just assume someone else is taking care of it. Speak up.
Don't let the inaction of others dictate your own response. This is so important. It makes you realize how easily we can be swayed by the actions of others, even when those actions might not be based on sound judgment. Now, is there anything that can amplify the power of social proof?
One thing that can really supercharge social proof is scarcity. The idea that we value things that are less available.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Those limited time offers or one-day sales that make you feel like you have to buy now or you'll miss out.
Exactly. And it's not just about marketing tactics. Scarcity plays a powerful role in how we perceive value and desirability.
Cialdini describes that experiment where cookies were rated as more desirable when they were scarce, even though they tasted exactly the same.
Exactly. And this is all because scarcity triggers what psychologists call psychological reactance.
Psychological reactance, what's that?
It's our natural tendency to want something more when our freedom to have it is limited. It's that rebellious feeling we get when someone tells us we can't have something or that it's only available for a limited time.
Oh, I get it. It's like the forbidden fruit effect.
Precisely. And that's why scarcity tactics are so effective in marketing. They play on our desire to maintain control over our choices. When that sense of control is threatened, we react by wanting that thing even more.
So when a salesperson tells us there's only one left in your size or this offer expires at midnight, our brains light up and we suddenly feel this urge to buy, even if we weren't all that interested before.
That's exactly it. Our psychological reactance kicks in, urging us to act before it's too late.
So how can we protect ourselves from being manipulated by these scarcity tactics? It's hard to resist that feeling of urgency when something we want is about to disappear.
The key is to recognize that scarcity often creates this emotional arousal that can cloud our judgment.
So our emotions hijack our rational decision-making process.
They can. So next time you feel that sense of urgency kicking in, take a deep breath and try to calm those emotional waves. Ask yourself, do I really need this, or am I just reacting to the fear of missing out?
That's great advice. It's about separating that emotional response from the logical evaluation of whether we truly want or need that item.
Exactly. Now, another principle that Cialdini dives into is the power of authority. This one looks at our tendency to obey authority figures even when their commands are questionable.
This is where things get a little unsettling, right? We're taught from a young age to respect authority, but we all know that just because someone has authority doesn't mean they're always right or ethical.
Absolutely. Cialdini brings up the Milgram experiment as a chilling example of how easily people will obey authority figures, even when those commands are clearly wrong.
That experiment is still so disturbing to think about. Participants were told to administer electric shocks to another person, and even though they knew it was wrong, many of them continued to obey the experimenter's commands.
It really highlights how powerful authority can be, especially when it's backed by symbols of power and legitimacy.
And like Cialdini points out, con artists exploit these symbols all the time to deceive people. They might wear a uniform, flash a badge, or use impressive titles to make people automatically defer to them.
It's all about triggering that automatic response to obey, even when we might have doubts.
So how can we resist this inappropriate authority influence? It's almost like it's built into us to obey, especially when we're feeling intimidated or unsure of ourselves.
The first step is to question that authority. Don't just blindly accept what someone says just because they have a fancy title or a uniform. Ask yourself, is this person truly an expert? How truthful can I expect them to be?
So look beyond those surface symbols of authority and really evaluate their claims critically.
Exactly. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel pressured to obey an authority figure, but their commands conflict with your own judgment, remember, you always have the right to question them.
It's such an important reminder that we have a choice. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of authority, but ultimately, we have the power to choose whether or not to obey. Now, this all makes me think about the power of our own commitments and how they influence our actions.
That's a great segue into Cialdini's next principle, commitment and consistency. This one delves into our deep desire to be consistent with our past actions and commitments. We want our actions to align with our beliefs and values.
It's like we don't want to feel like hypocrites or be seen as flip-floppers.
Exactly. And this desire for consistency can be a powerful tool for persuasion. Cialdini talks about the foot in the door technique as a prime example of how this principle works. It's the idea that if you can get someone to agree to a small request, they'll be more likely to agree to a larger request later on.
Oh, I know this one.
Yeah,
It's like getting someone to sign a petition for a cause and then later asking them to donate money to that cause.
that's it. That initial commitment, even if it's small, sets the stage for future compliance.
It's almost like we're trying to maintain a consistent narrative about ourselves.
And that extends to our beliefs and values too, not just our actions. If we've publicly stated a belief or taken a stand on an issue, we're more likely to act in ways that are consistent with that stance, even if our feelings have changed.
So it's like those situations where we feel pressured to stay true to a past commitment, even if it no longer feels right.
It happens, and this is why written commitments and public declarations can be so powerful. They make it harder for us to back down.
So it's like a tactic that plays on our fear of appearing inconsistent or unreliable.
It can be, and that's why it's so important to be aware of this tendency.
Yeah.
If you find yourself feeling pressured to stay consistent with a past commitment, but it no longer feels right, take a moment to reevaluate.
It's okay to change your mind. Don't let that need for consistency lock you into a course of action that no longer serves you.
Now, Cialdini added a principle to his book in later editions that's closely related to this idea of commitment and consistency. It's the principle of unity. This one focuses on how we are more easily influenced by people we share an identity with.
Ah, so this is where that sense of we-ness comes into play. It's like that feeling of belonging to a group, whether it's our family, our hometown, our political party, or even just a group of friends who share a common interest.
Exactly. And Cialdini explains how this sense of unity can be a powerful force for good, but it can also be exploited for negative ends.
He talks about how advertisers often use the we pronoun to try and create that sense of shared identity with their target audience.
Exactly. It's like that old we're all in this together approach. And it works because it taps into that deep-seated desire to belong, to be part of something bigger than ourselves.
And it can be especially strong when it's tied to our core values and beliefs, right?
Absolutely. Like our religious affiliation or political ideology, when someone appeals to those shared values, we're much more likely to be persuaded by them.
Which is why it's so important to be aware of this principle. It can make us more vulnerable to manipulation, especially when we're feeling uncertain or threatened.
If someone is trying to persuade you by appealing to a shared identity, take a moment to examine whether that sense of we-ness is genuine or if it's being manufactured to influence your decision.
It's like a reminder to check in with ourselves and make sure that our desire to belong isn't overriding our critical thinking skills.
It's a delicate balance.
This has all been incredibly eye-opening. It's like we've been given this new lens through which to view our interactions with others. It's a bit overwhelming to think about all these subtle influences at play at any given moment.
It can be. Perhaps we should take a short break here to let all this information sink in.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Cialdini's influence. We left off talking about the principle of unity and how that feeling of belonging can make us more susceptible to persuasion.
It's amazing how powerful that we-ness can be. It's almost like a shortcut for our brains. We're naturally inclined to trust and go along with the people we identify with.
It makes sense, right, from an evolutionary perspective. Our ancestors who could identify with and trust their tribe members were more likely to survive.
Exactly. That instinct is deeply ingrained in us. But like all these principles of influence, it can be manipulated.
It highlights the importance of understanding these principles, not just so we can be more persuasive, but also so we can protect ourselves from being unduly swayed by others.
Absolutely. It's about becoming more aware of the forces that shape our choices. Now, I want to connect this back to the principle of scarcity for a moment. Remember how Cialdini talks about that psychological reactance, that tendency to want something more when it's limited or unavailable?
Oh yeah, that feeling of, I have to have it now. Like when you see those limited time offers or everyone's going crazy for the latest gadget that's only available in limited quantities.
That's it. And it's fascinating how this ties back to our desire for control. When our freedom to choose is threatened, we instinctively react by wanting that thing even more.
It's like our brains are saying, hey, you can't tell me what I can and can't have.
Exactly, and that's why scarcity tactics are so effective in marketing. All those limited time offers and while supplies last, messages create a sense of urgency, pushing us to make decisions without thinking them through.
It's like they're playing on our fear of missing out.
They are. And Cialdini even points out how censorship can trigger this reactance. The minute something is banned or labeled as off limits, it suddenly becomes way more appealing.
Oh, like the forbidden fruit effect.
Precisely. So how do we manage the psychological reactance? It's tough to resist that innate desire for things that are hard to get.
Yeah, any tips?
Well, I think the key is to recognize when that reactance is being triggered and just take a pause before reacting. Ask yourself, do I genuinely want this? Or am I just reacting to the fact that it's scarce?
So it's about stepping back from that initial emotional response and making a conscious choice.
Exactly. Now let's circle back to the principle of commitment and consistency for a bit. Remember how we talked about our desire to align our actions with our past commitments and beliefs?
Yeah, it's like we have this inherent need to appear consistent, even when it might not be in our best interest.
Precisely. And Cialdini describes an experiment where participants who made a small commitment to a cause, like signing a petition, were more likely to agree to a larger request related to that cause later on.
Oh, so even a small commitment can kind of pave the way for larger ones.
Exactly. That initial commitment creates a sense of obligation to stay consistent. And this principle can be used for good, too.
Oh, interesting. So, like, if you can get someone to make a small commitment to a healthy habit, they might be more likely to stick with it.
That's the idea. But on the flip side, this principle can also be used to manipulate people. Cialdini gives the example of used car salespeople. They might get you to agree to a low price, only to later add on all these extra fees.
Oh, the classic bait and switch.
Exactly. And because you've already made that initial commitment to buy the car, you're more likely to go along with the higher price, even if it doesn't feel right.
So how can we protect ourselves from this kind of manipulation?
Well, for one thing, be wary of making those small commitments, especially if you have a feeling they might lead to bigger requests later on.
Good point.
And if you're ever in a situation where you're feeling pressured to remain consistent with a past commitment, even if you've changed your mind, don't be afraid to reevaluate and change course.
It's okay to admit you made a mistake or that things have changed. It's about doing what's right for you.
Now, going back to the principle of unity, I think it's really important to emphasize how that sense of we-ness can be strengthened by shared experiences.
Like when people go through something challenging or emotional together, it can create a really strong bond.
Precisely. Cialdini actually cites research showing that even something as simple as singing or dancing together can increase cooperation and helpfulness between people afterwards.
Wow, that's amazing. It makes me think of those team building exercises that some companies do.
That's a great example. Even if those experiences are a bit uncomfortable or challenging, they can create a strong sense of camaraderie.
It's like a reminder that we can harness this principle to build stronger communities and organizations.
Absolutely. Creating opportunities for shared experiences, whether it's volunteering together or just sharing meals, can really strengthen social bonds.
It's all about finding those common threads that bind us together. Now, as we've seen throughout this deep dive, each of these principles can be used for both good and bad.
Right. It's not about the principles themselves, but how they're used. It's about understanding how they work and making conscious choices about how we use them and how we protect ourselves from manipulation.
So it's about being aware of those subtle forces that influence our behavior, both for better and for worse.
Exactly. And Cialdini really emphasizes using these principles ethically and responsibly. He argues that persuasion shouldn't be about coercion or trickery.
It should be about genuine influence, right?
It is. It's about building trust and rapport and using that influence to create positive outcomes for everyone involved.
Win-win situations.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Cialdini also offers some advice on how to resist those manipulative uses of these principles. For one thing, he stresses the importance of recognizing the tactics that compliance professionals often use.
Like those limited time offers and only one left in stock messages we talked about. Those scarcity tactics.
Precisely. By recognizing those tactics, we're less likely to fall for them. He also encourages people to pay attention to their gut feelings.
Oh yeah, sometimes we get so caught up in trying to be polite or agreeable that we ignore those inner warning signals.
Absolutely. Trust your instincts. Don't be afraid to say no if something doesn't feel right or seems too good to be true.
And it's always okay to ask questions and get more information before making a decision.
It's about taking back control and making sure our choices are aligned with our values, not someone else's agenda. And, if you ever feel pressured or manipulated, don't be afraid to call out the tactic being used.
So just be upfront and say, hey, I see what you're doing here.
Sometimes that's all it takes. Simply acknowledging the tactic can diffuse its power. And remember, you always have the option to walk away from a situation if you feel uncomfortable.
It's a good reminder that we have more power in those situations than we think.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to highlight one last concept that Cialdini discusses. It's the phenomenon of captainitis. It's a term borrowed from aviation.
Captainitis, what's that?
It refers to situations where a crew member might fail to challenge a captain's decision even if they know it's wrong.
Oh, wow. Why wouldn't they speak up?
Well, it all goes back to the power of authority. We have this deep-seated tendency to defer to people in positions of power, even when we have doubts about their judgment.
So it's like a blind spot that can have serious consequences.
It can. And Cialdini argues that this phenomenon can occur in any situation where there's a power imbalance. It could be in the workplace, in relationships, or even when we're interacting with experts.
So how can we avoid falling into this captainitis trap?
I think it's about cultivating a healthy skepticism of authority. Don't just blindly accept what someone says, even if they have an impressive title or a lot of experience.
So always ask questions, get different perspectives, and trust your own judgment.
Exactly. Even authority figures are human. They make mistakes, they have biases, and they can be influenced by their own interests.
It's a good reminder that we should never surrender our critical thinking skills no matter who we're dealing with.
Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to emphasize that understanding these principles of influence can be incredibly empowering in all areas of our lives.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for human behavior.
It is. By understanding these patterns, we can navigate social situations with more confidence and awareness.
We can be more persuasive when we need to be, and we can protect ourselves from being manipulated.
Now, before we conclude in part 3, I'd like to highlight a few resources for our listeners who might want to learn more.
Great idea. I'm always up for expanding my knowledge.
For anyone looking to learn more about language and communication, I highly recommend checking out lingopediamagazine.com.
I've heard good things about them. They offer courses and ebooks on everything from writing to public speaking, right?
They do. They're a fantastic resource. And of course, we always encourage our listeners to subscribe to our show and share it with anyone who might be interested in the fascinating world of influence and persuasion.
We love connecting with curious minds.
Now, let's take a moment to think about everything we've covered so far. It's been a real journey exploring these subtle workings of influence.
I feel like I've learned so much about why we do the things we do.
It's truly remarkable how these principles shape our decisions and interactions.
I can't wait to hear your final thoughts and wrap up this deep dive in part 3. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into influence. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. We've covered so much ground.
I feel like I've learned so much about human behavior, about myself even.
It's fascinating stuff. And, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that understanding these principles of influence can be truly empowering.
It's like a secret weapon for navigating the social world.
Exactly. It helps us recognize those patterns at play and make more conscious decisions. And of course, it's not just about becoming master persuaders ourselves.
Right. It's about protecting ourselves from being manipulated.
Exactly. Now, Cialdini does offer some really practical advice on how to resist those manipulative tactics. He talks about the importance of recognizing the techniques that compliance professionals use.
Like those limited time offers, or only one left in stock, messages designed to trigger our sense of scarcity.
That's a prime example.
Yeah.
By recognizing them for what they are, we can resist those knee-jerk reactions.
It's like knowing the magician's tricks. It loses its power once you see how it's done.
Precisely. And he also encourages us to pay attention to our gut feelings. Sometimes we try so hard to be polite or agreeable that we ignore those inner warning
Oh,
signals.
I'm definitely guilty of that.
We all are sometimes. It's important to remember that we have the right to say no. If something feels off or too good to be true, it probably is.
It's about trusting those instincts and not being afraid to ask questions or walk away from a situation that feels uncomfortable.
Exactly. You always have the power to choose. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to quickly mention some resources for our listeners who want to learn more.
Oh, perfect. I'm always on the lookout for new learning opportunities.
If you're interested in language and communication, I highly recommend checking out lingopediamagazine.com.
I've heard of them. They have a ton of courses and ebooks on everything from writing to public speaking.
They do. They're a fantastic resource. And of course, we encourage you to subscribe to our show and share it with anyone who might be interested in the fascinating world of influence and persuasion.
We love connecting with curious minds. And to leave you with something to think about, which of these principles do you think you're most susceptible to?
That's a great question for some self-reflection.
By recognizing our own vulnerabilities, we can be more conscious of how these principles might be influencing our decisions. It's all about self-awareness, ultimately.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the psychology of persuasion.
It's been a pleasure exploring these concepts with you.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and like this podcast.